Paid for by A Common America. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. Learn more at www.acommonamerica.org.
Welcome to another episode of A Common America. This week, we'll focus on the main factors contributing to the lack of bipartisanship in D.C. and strategies and approaches that could foster greater bipartisanship. We'll also talk about a specific example of a state, battleground state, where voters will have an opportunity to choose between a very polarized individual and an individual who's taking a more bipartisan approach. And then we'll talk about examples in our government today where bipartisan groups are coming together to solve some of the biggest challenges that our government faces. So to set some context for today's episode, we wanted to really get into bipartisanship in DC in our political process. There are a number of issues that relate to bipartisanship and the lack of bipartisanship in our process today. How do we get to a place where our political system is so fragmented? Ultimately, it's people that elect officials, and so these are officials that are being elected in each of these districts on an every 2-year basis in the House. One of the biggest issues is kind of our fragmented media ecosystem. We've got very, very party-oriented and partisan media outlets that really do continue to contribute to the polarization of our political lens across society. A lot of Americans today still prefer to get their news from sources that align with their worldview, their political view. That kind of fragmented view just divides society even further, divides our view of the issues, because everyone hears the world through that lens, through their own lens of the news sources that they go to. And if they never seek out the other side, they only get that one perspective. When Fox came on the scene, Fox News came on the scene, they were the first that really gave a very polarized perspective of the political process that created a need or a feeling of a need to have the other side of the story. And so MSNBC came on the scene. CNN at that point was still kind of in the middle, especially in the international markets. But more recently, News Nation is trying to be bipartisan. They're trying to give, I don't know that any news organization can truly be bipartisan, but they're at least trying to, through multiple segments or using multiple interviews, they try to gather multiple sides to the same story. Any other examples you can think of that are trying to give both sides?
Well, I typically do bring up AP News, as that's the news source I use, because I believe they're still probably the closest to journalism as possible that we see today, that isn't as tainted by advertising as we see on the other, even CNN or Fox or anyone else. It seems like they try to go out and they report the news instead of create it or enhance or amplify it or give their opinion on it. So I think that they're one of News Nations is making an attempt, as you said, GM, to try to get both sides of the story. I think AP News is still trying to just report the news. What we haven't brought up is social media. And I know that's not the fragmentation part of Fox and CNN or whoever the opposites might be, but it seems like, as we're talking about, I hate to use that term, echo chambers, people are getting their feeds and it's coming from these sources and they're seeing what they want to see and they're excluding the things they probably don't want to see or doesn't resonate with them. So I think you start with the news sources, where they come from, and then they come in that algorithm, that filter, and then they present you what you want to see and hear. And that probably, again, amplifies this effect more so than just having, one on the left, one on the right, and one in the middle. Most people I know, I still read CNN online and AP online, but a lot of people, get most of their feed on their phone and it's tailored, I guess, or filtered, as we'd say. And I guess that filter and that tailor is biased, kind of, right? I'm not saying it's biased in the fact that it's not correct or negative in a way, but it's just biased towards your likes or against your dislikes, I guess.
I think it was in the 2016 election, most people, like the the interviews that they did, most people get their news through social media still. Like that's how they were finding out about issues that were being discussed, or press releases, or like it was social media driven. I suspect it is still true that many Americans are still getting their news primarily from social media.
That's where I find most of my news, and then I have to go to a non-social media source, like because I'm on Instagram so frequently and scrolling that it's like, I mean, that's that's how I found out about the bridge crash. And then I was like, oh, let me go to Apple News and see if I can find more about it,
And by way of comparison, Canada has passed laws that do not allow news to be pushed through social media. So that's a difference. That's a difference between the two countries. And it'll be interesting to watch how that affects their citizens' perspectives on topics. I think the initial read is that that's more frustrating to people than anything. Yeah. But it will be interesting to watch over time that the effect there. If we think about the political polarization, voters increasingly identify with one party or the other. But I was just reading an article this morning about how Americans still support democratic norms, even though the officials that they ultimately elect often do not. So, when you poll individuals in some of these areas where there are politicians that espouse views that pull us away from some of the democratic norms, whether that's disputing the legitimacy of an election or pulling reporters out of a news conference or something, there are constituents in those markets, in those districts. They're not supportive of those deviations from political norms, but they are still voting in those candidates that are. I thought that was really interesting in a way that gives me hope that there is still a way to show people, hey, this is the effect of your vote, the outcome of your vote. And, trying to find people that believe more like you do on the importance of democratic norms. These were the democratic norm violations, 4 of them. The first one is they ask people if the number of polling stations in an area that typically support the other political party, their opposition, should be reduced. They were asked if a candidate who questions an election outcome should be more loyal to their own political party than the election rules and the Constitution. The third political norm that they asked people about was if their current elected officials should consider ignoring court decisions that were issued by judges appointed by the opposing political party. And then the fourth political norm was that it was around if the government should be able to censor media that spends more time attacking their own political party than the other. The results showed that most Americans support democracy, with just 17.2% of Democrats and 21.6% of Republicans supporting one or more of the 4 norm violations. So small percentage of people thought any of those deviations from political norms were okay. But when the researchers looked at the data and looked at the candidates that were ultimately elected, what they found was the candidates had a quite a bit higher frequency of pulling away from some of those political norms. And so that's the piece of this to keep an eye on, is, again, the ultimate effect of the elections that are held. We need to be aware of how that polarization in our political process leads to candidates that pull away from these political norms.
I think that ties in a little bit to gerrymandering as well. Mm-hmm. That's been a hot topic for a long time, but in more recent years, I feel like we've seen some movement on that, whether it's been positive or negative. I think it's something that can be confusing for people to understand because the dividing lines have been confusing. And so it does, work to divide communities and groups of voters historically in ways that minimize competitive districts and use to pack as many supporters of one party into as few districts as possible, which will create quote unquote safe districts. Yeah, for that party. And I think it's been really great that it's been talked about more, because it has felt like something that, I don't want to say it's slipped under the radar, because it hasn't, but it just feels like people have been louder about it and how problematic it has been, and such a good way to marginalize communities and reduce their ability to elect candidates who actually will represent their interests. And I think, a little bit of that too is voting rights in general and some of the kind of weird laws that are state based. Like, wasn't there one about not you're not allowed to like give food or drink to people who are like waiting in voting lines? I don't know. I
Yeah,
don't know a lot.
In
I don't know
Texas, I
what
believe. Yeah.
is it. Okay, is it state? I didn't
it
know if
is
it was like
state.
city based or state based. But I remember seeing that and being like, just
And they're like, and I heard some of the news, and the election officials were saying, "Oh yeah, we just picked these election sites, and yeah, there just happens to be no shade at this one.
right,
That's just
nowhere to sit, no
we can't
shade.
control that. There's no shade." Huh?
It's on the far end of town where there's no public transportation doesn't go there, or it's very few and far between.
Mm-hmm.
And thinking about these communities that are generally impacted, which can be lower income communities sometimes, and just thinking about somebody taking a whole day off work, maybe not having PTO to cover it, maybe not being compensated for it, and still seeing them come out to vote and wait all day and maybe not get to vote and have to come back the next day because they opened late or they're moving people through slowly, just such a disheartening and low tactic. It's just,
Mm-hmm.
like gerrymandering, it's just such a low tactic, but it's not new, it's
No,
just
and
people are,
it felt as though there were some court decisions that supported improvements to breaking up gerrymandering, but then there have also been some setbacks in the last couple of years as well. So it does feel like certainly there's been some progress, but there hasn't been enough progress. That still continues to be an issue. Campaign finance and like the money in politics, the issue of money in politics, in a lot of ways, Mark, that seemed to be one of the issues that kind of, when we talked about starting this organization, that was among the issues, seeing how money in politics has led to polarization. Maybe talk a little bit about, from your perspective, the money in politics issue and how that has had some negative consequences.
Sure. The polarization component is that we see there's special interests. There's just, we see this massive amount of capital coming into these elections for advertising and, even people on the ground. And it's coming from corporations. It's coming from billionaires. We're seeing it on both sides, actually. I think if you look at the vote, if you're just thinking about in general that people are supposed to be elected based upon, becoming representatives of the constituents that they in their district. So if I'm to be a purist here, which I know is impossible in federal elections, ideally what should happen in a district is the only people that influence that election are local people. And it's not corporations. It's not lobbyists. It's not, lobbyists indirectly is what I mean. It's not billionaires from a different state. And people get upset about it. We're going to go off and impact local elections as well. We're going to go into different states that, the three of us don't reside in, and the group as a whole, we're going to go do that. But because we're trying to make the country better, I know everyone has their own position, but there's this undue influence that occurs from corporations, special interest groups, and these billionaires on both sides that I think just makes people who are a single vote, it makes them feel like their vote doesn't count as much, and they don't get the representation that they really want. There's a couple organizations done statistics on how much the actual, single vote counts as far as legislation goes, and it's a very low number. I think Representative us actually quoted it as 0.5% impact that individual voters have on overall legislation. So if that's accurate, that's really sad, and it's not the way it should be, in my opinion. From the founding fathers through the last couple hundred years of existence of the country, the vote should count. Everyone should vote, and everyone's vote should be counted. Whether or not you have the electoral college for the presidency, that's a whole different thing. But people shouldn't feel like their vote doesn't count, and because a billionaire that I won't name the ones I'm thinking of off the top of my head, but because they can go off and spend $150 million on a campaign, and it usually results in a victory for them. Not always, but usually. That can't happen if we want to have representative government.
Yeah, and I think part of what we're seeking to do is to use the system that we have today to counterbalance the negative effects of this money in politics issue is we're trying to, the system that we have today is imperfect, but it is there. And how can we use that to serve as a counterbalance back toward the principles of democracy, back toward bipartisanship, to use that system to support bipartisanship and ultimately to support building a better society and a better political process for all of us.
Agreed. It should be, we keep talking about these topics, whether it's common sense gun control or immigration reform. The whole basis of our super PAC is that it's about people agreeing, Americans in common have these agreements on what we need to go fix. And we're not getting that today. So I would love to use every tool at our disposal to go out and try to make that happen, whether it's being a super PAC or volunteering or whatever it might be. We and all of the people listening should go out and do whatever they can to make sure that their vote is heard and we have representative government and we get the issues that we want solved addressed in the House and the Senate and passed on to the president for signature.
We have this big example of bipartisanship recently. The Senate passes the $1.2 trillion spending package that the House had passed. The Senate passed this on a 74-24 vote. This agreement, Biden was talking about it and talked about this agreement represents a compromise, which neither side got everything that they wanted. And I think that is, if you summarize what bipartisanship is, it requires compromise. It requires that not everyone is going to get what they want out of the agreement because everyone does have different perspectives, different priorities, different needs. But this process that we have means that everyone got something out of this. Everyone gets something that moves their lives, their society, the political process forward.
Is this considered a landmark or historic spending bill, or in the amount or in the way that it came about compared to other bills? Does anybody?
I think just based upon its size, it is a landmark. The size, $1.2 trillion, is a huge spending package. But I do think that when you look at where our political process is today, how long it's taken, whether it's electing a speaker or whatever, like the process lately has just not supported solving big problems recently. And so the fact that they were able to pass it in this climate, in an election year where everyone's looking to make an example out of the other party, it is notable. And I think that in the way it is a landmark that our politicians were able to pass this in an election year as polarized as politics is today.
I think it's interesting as well that this is an example of bipartisanship. And so we know it's possible. The challenge for me about this is that the only way we got here is because the threat of shutting the government down, threat of people not getting checks and some of the military infrastructure shutting down. I mean, so I want to praise where praise is due. I want to say this is great because it was a 74-24 vote in the Senate. It got signed and we avoided the shutdown, which is what everybody's afraid of. But it takes something this severe and this, I guess, monumental in a way of the government shutdown occurring to get these people to actually participate with each other. And so again, I want to say, give praise where praise is due, that it did happen and it got done. And I just want to try to figure out how we can use this as an example of, well, we did it here. Why can't we do it on immigration reform like they tried? Why can't we do it climate? Why can't we do it on other topics that we've been discussing? It'd be a good lesson to learn of how we encourage constituents to support their senators and their representatives to actually move in this direction. And then also how does that happen within Congress itself?
And seeing Biden call further on lawmakers, like saying, this is good, but it's not enough almost. We're not done yet, I think is closer to kind of what he said is, we're not done yet. He's still looking for lawmakers to pass a bipartisan bill that includes aid to Ukraine, Taiwan, other areas as well. And that's been really contentious, I think, in the news. A bipartisan border security plan, which, again, another thing that's just been not seeing a lot of movement on, significant of movement on. So, but I think you're right that it is still something to celebrate. It's a big win. It's still kind of a small win in the overall picture, I think, of what we would like to see, of what we know needs to be done. But I think we're hoping that this is a good sign for what bipartisanship in DC can look like this year. We would like to say in the future overall, but I think we just have to take it one year at a time, one step at a time.
Yeah.
At least the
Well, I think-
lawmakers have to go through the exercise of working together to make it happen. So that in itself is a great thing, right?
I see that a lot for people who, I think like myself, who don't have a super good grasp on government budgets and spending, and you see these numbers and you're just like, where does that come from? And what I saw also on social media, people questioning, the government shutdown, and that always feels like it's kind of looming. It's felt like that has been looming over the past several years. I have family that work, in government sectors, and nobody that's really been like super nervous about it impacting them directly, like government shutdowns, but just you feel like it's always kind of a cloud. And it feels like, I think I had said to GM at one point, it feels like the government living paycheck to paycheck. They're not able to, or they're not willing to think really long term. It just feels like, okay, we made it through this government shutdown, but who knows what's coming next, and when the next one might be, and how far will this package get us?
Yeah.
1.2 trillion sounds like an unreal number.
It's funny. I'm the opposite. I think about the defense budget being almost $1 trillion. And I think, 1.2, that's not that much.
Yeah, right. In comparison. Yeah.
No, I mean, compared to the debt and everything else that's going on.
Yeah,
but
sure.
Yeah,
I think about the fact that they passed the spending package as contrasted with the continuing resolution approach that they've done for shorter term in the past. And I think a lot of people don't understand the difference between those two. A continuing resolution where when we're running up to a shutdown and the government will pass a continuing resolution that gives us maybe 2 months or 3 months worth of additional money and runway in that decision. All that does is it takes last year's budget and it just extends out to the right by, separated in the same percentages as last year's budget. But the problem is every year the priorities and the needs are different. And so if you just continue out last year's budget by 3 more months, you're not solving for today's problems. You're solving for yesterday's problems. And oftentimes you're just extending places that are getting a lack of funding and that are getting too much funding. And so by passing an actual spending package, you're saying, we're going to wipe away all of the percentages. We're going to look at where this money needs to go, and we're going to send the money to the right places based upon this year's fiscal priorities. And so that's where I'm really excited that they took this approach and actually solved for today's spending priorities, so taking us all the way through the end of this fiscal year. Yes, it is only 6-9 months away, but the fact that they did this allows us to reset the percentages in the right way. And so that's also another part of the fact that this was a huge win for the government at a very polarized time. So I'm glad that they took this approach as opposed to a continuing resolution.
But I think also the fact that many lawmakers in DC have used the budget issue and the shutdown as leverage. And we've seen this happen for a couple of years. The first thing you saw after this passed in the House was MTG calling for the removal of the House Speaker again. So the Freedom Caucus thought that they had a lot more leverage, I think, than they do. They did during the McCarthy's tenure, but now with Johnson and the Democrats potentially supporting maybe his position, now that we're almost 50-50 in the House, I just thought it was interesting that immediately occurred. I think we just need to look at lawmakers who want to use leverage for things that are detrimental to the country and the lawmakers that don't. We can spell out who those people are, and we will in the future, but that's one that comes to mind right away after we saw this get signed. So we've all spent a little bit of time looking around the country at House seats that we feel could be more bipartisan. I'll put it that way. Just House seats today in different states that could be more bipartisan, that could be instrumental in helping us move forward all these issues that everyone wants solved, or most people want solved in the country. When I started out kind of the search on what are some of the extreme politicians in the country, where do they reside, which party are they, what's their track record, what legislation have they put forward, what roadblocks are they putting in the way of others making progress? And Arizona came up multiple times. I started looking at Andy Biggs. There's a couple of Freedom Caucus people in Arizona, which we are bipartisan, and we're not only targeting the right, we're targeting some people on the left too, but the Freedom Caucus, in my opinion, stands out for lack of legislative action and progress for the country. And Arizona, we've looked at it over the last couple of years since McCain died, to be frank. Things have gotten a little strange with Kari Lake. and the governorship, and then the Senate, and then the House. So Arizona is interesting because we know what happened in the 2020 presidential election there, and we looked at all the lawsuits that were filed after the election and all that kind of stuff. And so I looked at an opportunity there to try to flip, or at least envisioning flipping some of these seats in the House. If you could impact 2 or 3 House seats in Arizona, you could actually have a huge impact on the House's ability to actually pass real legislation, because a couple of those people are, again, instrumental in blocking legislation that we think most Americans would actually support. So Arizona, the one that always comes to mind for many reasons, and we'll talk in more detail about this, is Paul Gosar. My personal list, I would love to see Paul defeated in the next election. He's running against a Democrat named Quacy Smith. We will talk a little bit more about Quacy as well. But Paul Gosar is running in the Arizona's 9th congressional district race, and we would love to either have him primaried or moved on in the general election in the fall.
You were talking about how Arizona is such an interesting state. I think one of the statistics that stuck out to me is just how independent and independently minded Arizonans are, where more than 188,000 folks identify themselves as Republican, more than 195,000 people consider themselves or register as Democrat. 313,000 people identify as other, which includes independent and non-affiliated voters. So that statistic stands out across all the states as one place where Arizona do consider themselves independent, and they don't affiliate purely with a political party necessarily. And I think that gives, and that's kind of, in a lot of ways, that's our core demographic, is people that will look at the issues and decide who is going to support those issues and support them in the political office. And so it stands out to me that so many people register as independent and as other in Arizona.
Yeah, and Quacy is a really interesting contender, I think. For those who don't know, he was a former, or is a U.S. Marine, served as a police officer, federal investigator. He's an attorney. He's very accomplished. He's about serving his community in various different ways we've seen. And Paul was first elected to Congress in 20. Prior to serving in Congress, he's known for his dentistry practice, which he had for over 25 years. So the background alone, as a very, shallow point to look at between these two, is very interesting, and I think when I had seen the stats about Arizona's voter registration report, which is, where it is noted that over 300,000 people identify as other, as voters. Interesting that Gosar has served for so long, I think. Again, I don't know who any of his previous contenders have been and what that looks like, but I think that's significant. Quacy Smith would be a really interesting candidate. I think this is going to be a really interesting race to keep an eye on as well, just to watch how it develops. People are very familiar with Gosar. He's been there for a very, very long time. Quacy has been quoted saying that he believes Arizona should be represented by a moderate who can work with both parties. He sees this election as an opportunity to get some synergy and get Middle America their voice back. And I do think that that's a really, really good opportunity for Arizona to make some significant change in their state. Key issues, listed on Quacy Smith's campaign site, I think they do speak to his moderate sense that he's hoping for Arizona. Gosar has been a little bit more staunch.
You're more polarized.
He's more
sure.
polarizing. Yeah, we can say that. We can say that.
We can say it, yeah.
We can say it. I think on immigration, Gosar said, it's true that the United States is a nation of immigrants, but more importantly, the United States is a nation of laws. Whereas Quacy's there supporting immigrant integration through language and cultural programs, and he calls for bipartisan collaboration for meaningful reform while upholding the rule of law. That's from his site, where he talks about his kind of key issues. So it's nice to see that he has used the term bipartisan on his page. I think probably more than once, but that's a significant one for immigration, I think. Very different on reproductive rights, very different. Gosar believing life begins at conception. He said, for my efforts in Congress, I have a 100% lifetime rating from the National Right to Life Committee. That was on Gosar's website, I believe, for under his key issues. Quacy on his website, key issues section, opposes extreme measures on both sides of the debate. He's seeking common ground by promoting policies to reduce abortions while respecting women's autonomy. Huge, significant for Arizona, considering Gosar's stance. He's using terms that we like, which is common ground.
Definitely.
He's, not shy about saying he's opposing extreme measures on both sides of the debate. Again, when he talked about Quacy believing that Arizona should be represented by a moderate, I feel like he's really there. Democrat leaning moderate, but it feels like he's really willing and able to see both sides to make concessions to get things passed for the betterment of Arizona. Yeah, it's going to be a really interesting race.
He seems to be taking such a view of the community, and I think that comes probably from his time in law enforcement, being really close to the people, being really close to the effects of a number of these issues, not all, but a number of them, on what he's now seeking to be his constituents in this higher political office. On the economic side, Gosar talks about how he believes in free market economics, and the federal government is not the reason the United States is the world's largest economic power, but rather the government is merely the beneficiary of our free market system. And you contrast that against Quacy, who talks about he endorses moderate trade policies to balance regulatory frameworks to ensure financial stability. And they sound similar, but I think the more nuanced perspective to balance regulatory frameworks with financial stability really speaks to policies that will benefit more people, not large companies based in Arizona, but also the constituents of Arizona.
Arizona is a state that has been and will continue to be heavily impacted by climate change. Looking alone at what decreased water availability would impact everything. Agriculture, tourism, supply chains, what kind of energy drain that might take for cooling. It's a public health issue, safety, wildfires. I mean, there's just endless amount of kind of bad and scary things that Arizona is facing and can continue to face. In 2020, Phoenix had 145 days with temperatures at or above 100 degrees, making it one of the hottest years on record. And it's also, according to statewide precipitation patterns, Arizona has been in some stage of drought since 1994, which is just wild to think about. And I went to the Saguaro National Park 2 years ago, and very heavy drought. I mean, it was everything, there, it's still a beautiful park, but it was like, wow, the saguaros are just dried out. There was no wildlife. There was nothing, I spoke a little bit to the park ranger there, and he just was lamenting about it. He'd been there for a long time, and just talking to him briefly about the changes that he's seen in his park, which also, again, impacts tourism. If the saguaros are not blooming, if there's not wildlife, if the saguaros are dried out and look like skeleton, what is there to bring to, what's bringing people to the national parks, which are so treasured by a lot of us. So yeah, Arizona is definitely in the hot seat.
Literally, yes. I mean, if you contrast the two candidates that are vying for the House in that specific district, where in 2015 Paul Gosar boycotted a speech by the Pope after learning he would be speaking largely about climate change. That's why he boycotted that speech. Paul called climate change a socialist talking point, and he wanted no part of that, so he boycotted the speech by the Pope. In 2019, Paul Gosar opposed the Green New Deal, saying that the Green New Deal is another climate change socialist pipe dream that attacks American jobs and our way of life. All this in a state that has had as you said, 145 days in 2020 with temperatures above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, with the water issues that the state has, it's pretty unbelievable. And then with the shift in control of the House in 2023, Paul was asked to rejoin the House Committee on Natural Resources, which is kind of unbelievable given his perspective on that. It's more about undermining the natural resources for his constituents as opposed to supporting any positive change quite clearly. You contrast that with Quacy's focus on investment in research and development for green technologies. He has supported renewable energy sources, energy efficient technologies, and sustainable agriculture practices. Those are the policies that will balance, as he talked about earlier. Yes, there's some regulation, but focusing on the ability to continue to have a growing a growing economy when you have such high impact from climate issues.
And not expecting that they can just solve where they're at. We can't really backpedal, I think, from where we're at with climate change and where things that are happening. But we don't have to make it worse. And right now they have a representative who is doing nothing and doesn't want to do anything and is a climate change denier. That's what he's been called. I feel like that aligns with the lack of support he's given to legislation and bills for his state regarding how they can make Arizonans more comfortable. I mean, it's just it is feels very bizarre to have somebody like that making, not in charge of your state, but it just feels very bizarre to have somebody like that representing your state when you are one of the states that's being impacted the most.
That's what I'm hopeful about, is that people in Arizona, because they are impacted more than almost any state in the country with the heat, I'm hoping that they'll see it's real, they know it's real, and they'll want to take action to effectively, what we talked about before, is preserve their way of life. Because if they don't do something soon or help the rest of us do something about it globally, then, as we said, if it gets to a point where you don't have enough energy to cool that many people when it's 127 or 132 degrees outside in August, it doesn't work. So something needs to be done, and I think they're going to know that, and I'm hopeful that they'll hopefully make a change this next cycle.
Especially
well,
people
they certainly
who
have an opportunity to elect an official that believes and cares about the future, whether that's the future of their agriculture industry, tourism public health. Yeah. So what do we think would be the primary significance that it would have on Arizona, a battleground state, for a moderate leaning Democrat to win this election? What would change?
Feels like everything based on the two different, viewpoints on their key issues. It feels like, wow, what an opportunity for change for Arizona. It'd be a big change, a positive one. I think it feels more forward moving. His stance feels more forward moving. It's always hard to just go off of what is on the campaign site versus what can actually be put into practice and what other roadblocks that he might face, either of them, but Quacy might face should he win this. But if I were in Arizona, I would feel very hopeful to even have a candidate like this that's not super left and also not super right like Gosar.
I kind of think about this question in three different ways. Think about it on the national level, at the federal government, having another voice. Yes, it's only incremental. It's only one voice among 535, but it is one more voice that is taking a bipartisan view, that is taking a more moderate perspective, representing his state. So having another person that is a bipartisan thinker is everyone counts. Every single one counts. At the state level, I think the fact that someone defeating Gosar will have an effect at the state level. It'll be noteworthy at the state level. Having someone that is bipartisan and moderate will also be noteworthy at the state level in their elections, in their in the following election after that, if that occurs. That will be something that the state will make note of. And at the local level, this means that people who are in that large percentage of people who consider themselves other, who consider themselves independent, that they will have a voice that is going to take their perspective into consideration when voting on bills, when voting on laws at the federal level. And so I think it's noteworthy at those three different levels, this particular choice between Paul Gosar and Quacy Smith will have.
And I think if you're you look at this practically, things that impact Arizona, we talked about this a little bit before, immigration reform and climate. For those two topics, there are many others, reproductive rights, that are very important to Arizonans, I know. But Arizona and Texas are being impacted the most by the current immigration system, we'll call it. And I think we know what Gosar's approach is to immigration. It's build a wall and be done with it. And there's no forward, as you said, Brianna, there's no forward thinking or forward movement on making or coming up with legislation that actually works for everyone, or at least 80% solution that would work for everyone. That and the climate, I think if you had one more voice, as you said, GM, in Congress talking about the immediacy of climate impact and how we have to do something about it today, I think someone like Quacy would be able to go in there, Quacy Smith would be able to go in there and bring that voice to DC and impact the state of Arizona with both of those measures if they could actually get legislation passed there, especially immigration, but I think climate as well.
I think that's great. So in this episode, we've talked about the importance of bipartisanship in our government. We've talked about specific examples where the rubber meets the road in a battleground state like Arizona. Why don't we zoom out one more time just to talk about groups that are taking a bipartisan lens at the federal level?
Yeah, so there's a handful of significant ones that we've looked at. The Bipartisan Policy Center, the Problem Solvers Caucus, the Gang of Eight, and a newer one, for me anyways, was the Climate Solutions Caucus. We'll link these in the show notes so that you can explore further, and they're definitely groups that will be explored further in the podcast as well, but do take the time to familiarize yourself with their work and their impact. Super interesting makeups of these groups, managed to accomplish quite a bit, even though it may seem like there's, we're definitely lacking in bipartisanship. There's no real question there, but these groups are really working hard to make significant changes. One that we want to focus on today is the Climate Solutions Caucus. As Mark had mentioned, climate change is going to impact Arizona quite a bit. So this felt very timely to bring up the Climate Solutions Caucus, which is a group of bipartisan members led by co-chairs Congressman Andrew Garbarino and Congresswoman Christy Houlihan. They've been working together to combat climate change while also protecting the economic prosperity of the United States. This is a group dedicated to building a constructive dialogue about climate change, economics, energy, and conservation among members of Congress, global leaders, environmental organizations, and business leaders. So there's definitely a lot there. They have a lot of work ahead of them, but what a great group to have working to enact change right now. Looking at the Climate Solutions Caucus, also brought up another growing caucus called the Conservative Climate Caucus, which was started, I think, 3 to 4 years ago by Republican Congressman John Curtis out of Utah. Their main mission is to get members comfortable with thinking and talking about climate change. And he was quoted saying, "It doesn't matter to me if they struggle with climate change. It doesn't matter to me if they don't like the science. All that matters to me is that they'll come and listen. I have found that the more they come, the more they talk about this, and the more comfortable they get with it." And I think it feels very positive to have this group essentially like a Republican climate caucus, and that they're willing to just come and listen. And it doesn't matter if this may not affect your state, but just be willing to come and listen and keep an open mind to it and have a conversation about it. So that's a kind of a new and emerging group that I think is worth keeping an eye on as well. That could have, seems like that could also have a significant impact for other more conservative elected officials that are struggling with the idea of climate change and the potential impact that it could have, is having on the United States. Yeah. So
I think the data is just too evident now. I think when Al Gore put out his movie all those years ago, people thought, "Oh, that's the future. That's not going to happen. That's not based on reality." But I'm in the Rocky Mountains, and the snowpack is at an all-time low. The river's already low. Spring is going to be, unless we get a lot of rain here, fires are going to be awful, probably the worst ever this summer is what they're thinking. So I think people are just seeing the data points. They're seeing the weather patterns, the lack of cold, snow, the heat, and you can't just continue year after year to just ignore it. I mean, some people put their head in their sand, but they've been doing that for 10 years. Some people have been doing that for so long and they just can't do it anymore because it's affecting them personally in their home state, their hometown. So again, I'm not hopeful that we see more impact from climate change, but I'm just hopeful that people stop pretending it isn't happening. And that caucus is a good way to at least start talking about it and trying to understand it on the conservative side.
All of these big issues require bipartisanship, and that's really why that is the topic that we focused on this week. We talked about the places where bipartisanship is challenging at the federal level. We talked about some key examples of where bipartisanship was absolutely required in order for our big spending bill, our big budget for the fiscal year to this year's priorities was able to get passed purely through bipartisan efforts on both sides to come to the middle. And we talked about one of the battleground states where there's a very specific choice to pick a very polarized individual or to pick someone who understands that in order for progress to happen, the bipartisanship has to be the approach that's taken. And so, yeah, bipartisanship, it continues to be hugely important in our elections, and we wanted to use today's topic to focus and zoom in on that. Thank you so much for joining us this week on A Common America.